Okay, welcome to the second lecture on the policy and legislation module. This lecture will cover everything else that we didn't cover in the last lecture. So in the previous lecture, the focus was on the evolution of waste laws. We talked about waste hierarchy index, and then we also talked about extended producer responsibility. This lecture will be more about connecting the dots and seeing the circular economy policy and legislation as a whole, instead of only the focus on, let's say, the end-of-life legislations. As you could see that I don't have video because my laptop obviously crashed as I sent you a message. So this lecture, there won't be video, but you will still get the slides and the audio recording, and then I will upload it in YouTube. After this lecture, you just have one module in which we talk about criticisms on circular economy. Okay, so let's go into the lecture. Okay, this lecture is going to be focused on three different parts. The first, we are going to discuss the Circular Economy Action Program, and then we are going to take a little bit of a detailed look into the Eco-Design Directive in particular. And once we do those things, we are going to talk about how the various different circular economy policies, why there is a need for harmonization between these policies and integration between these policies, because quite often than not, these policies are in conflict with each other. What do I mean by that? I'm going to give you a few examples, and then we will end the lecture on that note. Okay, so when it comes to the first Circular Economy Action Program or circular economy policies in general, right, it's very interesting to notice that a lot of it has been focusing on this part, the end-of-life waste part. We know that there are mandatory recycling rate targets, and we know that there are increasing bans in landfills and addressing more and more end-of-life waste towards reuse or recycling. So there are already existing laws in this particular section. But the researchers during those times were concerned about introducing more binding legislations and directives in these two different parts of the product design, so either in production or in use phase and consumption. So the three important areas that was marked out were one on the reuse, repair and remanufacturing policy. So the argument from the researchers were that we have to have a right to repair in general. So that is already, as we speak, in 2020 Circular Economy Action Program, it's a part, and there is already a right to repair implementation. And for remanufacturing, as you could imagine, essentially a standardization of parts and ensuring that the integral components of the product function longer than the products themselves are part of this policy mix. But one important area was that of public procurement for resource efficiency. You already know the definition of resource efficiency. It's in the first lecture. It's the lowest environmental impact possible for a particular product. Okay, so what does it mean by public procurement for resource efficiency policy? They have what's called as the GPP, the Green Public Procurement. In essence, you have a lot of public agencies who buy stuffs, right? So for instance, if you take municipalities, they buy a lot of stuffs. And research has shown that when you have an organized purchase department, okay, like in the case of a larger Norwegian municipalities, it has shown proactive action in which they can coordinate purchase and procurement in such a way that they can adhere to the sustainable, let's say, procurement regulations. As you could see in one of the cases in Sweden, the public procurement of refurbished ICT equipment by Swedish municipalities as a voluntary measure was taken up. So these sort of measures are really possible when you have large departments. The challenge is when you have small municipalities which doesn't have, let's say, an exclusive section for purchase and procurement. There it becomes a bit more of a challenge. So how do we navigate those kind of challenges still remains the question. But you could see already that the member states themselves are taking a lead in applying a few of these policies, essentially in public procurement. The third important area was strengthening secondary resource markets. This is a bit more complicated. Because, on one hand, there is this need of incorporating recycled content into the product, right? So you have an end of life waste, you recycle it, you produce a product. The idea is to take the product, put it back again in a fresh one so that we can start using them again. But sometimes, because we create stuff such a complicated manner, that we end up producing products which are not technically very pure, which means that you have, on the one hand, legislation to ensure recycled content going back into the products. On the other hand, we have legislations asking for even better products, durable product, long functioning product with a lot of purity. This is essentially in contradiction with each other. So there you have to have a set of policies and implementation to make sure that the recycled product meets certain standards and they are implemented back in the fresh new products again. So these are the three areas of concern for the CEAP, and a few of them have already been addressed in the Circular Economy Action Program 2020. But you could see that when things are moving in EU level, nation states have also taken initiatives. I already talked about a particular one by France on preventing planned product obsolescence. We have talked in detail about obsolescence already, so you could read this law in which France has done a really important work of preventing planned obsolescence from the companies. Okay, in a nutshell, what has been the focus of CEAP 2020? A lot. So we already talked about right to repair, it's there. And there are numbers for mandatory minimum of green public procurement coming up. Obviously, we cannot go into complete details on every single thing. I'm just giving you an overview. And if you want, if you're interested in a particular sector, of course, you can go and take a look into the particular sector. And there is also now a need for substantiation of the environmental impact of the product by the companies. What do I mean by that? You have to have a sort of standardized LCA numbers that you have to bring forth to the table. And there is also increasingly focus not just on the end of life level, but also on the production phase. So the circularity in production is also a focus now through the Industrial Emissions Directive and so on. And there is a talk about introduction of a common charger for all these products. Let's see how it works out. And of course, on an EU level as well, we have a talk of countering premature obsolescence. This is a huge issue. If companies plan obsolescence, then it is really going against one of the important loops of durability of circular economy, right? Then, of course, the introduction of recycled content back into the products, especially for batteries. This is something that I have already talked about in the previous lecture, and you can refer to it. And the most important concern is that of blocking waste export, because you can easily have, let's say, a really environmentally friendly country or a particular geography if you don't have to take care of your waste, and if you can export all of them to outside, then it becomes way easier. But EU and EC wants to prevent that. There are two reasons for it. One is to adhere to international conventions, not to export toxic substances outside. But there is also increasingly a need of seeing waste as a resource, right? So as I pointed out, if you export the black mass, which has all the critical components from the end-of-life battery waste, to outside, as EU is doing a lot currently, then you miss out on having critical materials for the battery production as well. So there is also a need for binding legislation there, and EU is moving slowly towards that as well. And of course, in all the other sections of reuse, recycling, minimization of hazardous substances, and standardization to ensure compatibility and so on. So the other things we have already discussed a lot. So this is in a nutshell what CEAP 2020 is all about. I'll upload the document to UV so you can also take a look into that. Okay, let's jump into the Eco-Design Directive. Firstly, for the Eco-Design Directive, there was this particular definition of which products they are going to implement this particular directive for. So the definition was that the products should have significant environmental impact. So what does it mean by significant? The definition there was 1000 petajoules per year of energy consumption of that particular class of product. So here in itself we see the first important point, that is the definition was based on energy consumption. Okay, and then once you have chosen a particular set of products to come up with this eco design, the next step was to go to this preparatory study. And in this preparatory study they had a methodology of eco design for the energy related products. So based on this methodology they defined what could be the, let's say, the measures that we can take to have better design of these products, to implement this concept of eco design. And during this let's say the preparatory study stage, they had the consultation with different stakeholders, and then you had a sort of voluntary agreement. This was a market-based approach between different players in the market for the product. So everybody came together, they had a discussion on how to improve the product and to lower the environmental impact, and then they came with a set of suggestions which was then drafted as let's say implementing measures. This was more binding, which was ratified by the regulatory committee and then by the EU Parliament. Okay, so this was the overall view of how the eco design directive took shape. We are going to see this in action for one particular example of vacuum cleaners. I'm going to show you in the next slide how this worked out. Okay, but the eco design directive came in 2009 if I recall right, and already in 2020 the researchers are pointing out there has been significant improvements due to the eco design directive. The first one is that the average household in EU has saved more than 500 euros per year due to this improvement in efficiencies, as well as the fact that you have 175 million tons of oil equivalent per year reduction and savings in energy consumption. This is actually equal to the entire Italy's yearly energy expenditure. So you could see that we are having significant savings due to the eco design directive's implementation. So we talked about the implementation of eco design directive and taking stakeholders into consultation and so on, right? So let's take a look into one particular product in which it worked, the case for vacuum cleaners. So what they did was, as I told you, they went into the preparatory study stage, right, in the first case. So they did an LCA, life cycle analysis, and they found out that for vacuum cleaners, similar to washing machines we studied before, the use phase was having the maximum impact. And this is something that we already knew from the case of washing machine as well. So the first initial thoughts were that in the working document, the idea was to limit the maximum power consumption in general for the whole vacuum cleaners, because the idea or the general perspective is that with increasing power consumption, the power or the performance of vacuum cleaners is going up. But they studied and found out that this wasn't necessarily the case. So they tried to put a cap on the maximum power consumption. They tried to put a cap on the time-based maximum power consumption. Both of them was a part of the first working document. And then came the first consultation, which was open to all the stakeholders, right? So some non-governmental organizations, they commented on the use of hazardous substances during the processing or the production of this vacuum cleaner. So they wanted that to be taken away. So that was taken into account. And during the second consultation, what was observed was that the noise level performance, which was taken to be critical in the working document and the first consultation, was sort of omitted in the next consultation. So this was criticized by multiple stakeholders, saying that the companies should also take into account that they have to bring down the noise levels. They have to make sure that the performance is optimal as well. And Belgium, as a member state, it also took part in this consultation. And the comment from Belgium was that you have to also take into account resource efficiency and lifetime. So the concern was that of durability, The concern was that of increased resource efficiency. That is, when you make a product, try to have significantly low environmental impact as possible. So that was the comments on from the member states. So finally, after this sort of voluntary discussion, it went into the stage of implementing measures. Okay, and there in final regulation, apparently the DG, I think the Director General's office, introduced all of a sudden criteria of durability for both hose and motor. As you could see, that wasn't present in any of the discussion. So the EC wields a certain amount of power as well. Here they introduced the important point on durability, and that was suddenly made also a part of the implementing measures. In fact, the research article that drafted this about the vacuum cleaners comments that some of the stakeholders were taken by surprise that this was never a part of discussions in the second consultation, but it was finally implemented. But even right from the working document and to other phases, the important concept of implementing durability measures was already in discussions, but it was omitted in the second consultation and brought back again in the implementing measures. So this is how this is one example of how the back and forth works in terms of implementing a policy measure in Ecodesign Directive. Okay, we talked about the methodology of eco-design of energy-related products, right? The MEERP. What goes on inside this MEERP methodology? Obviously, we cannot discuss all the details, but let's have a brief look into the broad strokes. What you see here is that in the first place, they take what's called as the base case. What's a base case? Imagine any product in the market, anything. So let's say a vacuum cleaner or a fridge. First place to start with is to take the average of that particular product. Of course, we have so many different designs, so many different types inside the product. We just want to take an average representative base case. Okay, here is the base case. And with improvement in design over time, here the better designs goes in the x-axis, what we want to achieve is to have the least life cycle cost, the lowest possible damage to the environment. So we take the base case with relatively high life cycle costs in euros, and we want to design better in such a way that we reach this trough with the lowest cost and to reach the LLCC. Of course, you can design way better, but it also comes with high acquisition cost and so on. But one important thing that you have to notice is that these things were done on the basis of energy consumption. With better design, of course, you also have a decrease in energy consumption, no doubt. With a low energy consumption, you have low environmental impact. That's also true. But in this course, we have discussed in detail, energy consumption is just one part of the picture. Circular economy has a lot of other things that are in the picture as well. You have to take into account various different loops. How do we include the concepts or the notion of all different loops inside an eco-design methodology remains the challenge. Okay? Now people try to advocate different sorts of methodology to make sure that the eco-design directive just doesn't focus on energy, but also focus on other aspects of circular economy. So what are the suggestions? One suggestion is to use what's called as equivalent annual cost. Okay. What does that mean? At this point of time, in this particular year, we have a product and the product has, let's say, X amount of energy consumption in use phase. What we want to do is to design better products which has lower energy consumption in, let's say, use phase, right? But let's say in few more years, you could also come up with even better products and let's say even lower energy consumption and even lower environmental impact in the use phase. How do you translate or how do you compare them with each other? Here they advocate for what's called as to have a metric of equivalent annual life cycle cost, because you have to take into account so many different things. You might in the future create a really durable product, but at the same time, even when you decrease its use phase energy, you might create a product in such a way that the manufacturing energy goes up. And so that's a concern. So to compare between them, they suggest for an alternative sort of parameter to have this equivalent annual cost, so that we can come to a judicious decision on to choose for which products are designed to go for. And they advocate for other important factors to be taken into account, including durability, repairability, and the availability of spare parts and so on. And the other important part here is to have systematic inclusion of externalities. What if you design a product which has lower energy consumption according to the Eco Design Directive, but uses non-recyclable material and it's not fit for reuse? That is also a concern. So to have these externalities included while we develop a methodology is really critical. So that's also something we advocate for. And the third important part of the picture is not just to focus on energy, but also on materials. So how much it is capable to refurbish those things, how much is it easy to swap the parts of the product, and so on. So to also very importantly take into picture the possible use of recycled material into the design of new products is also falling under the category of systematic inclusion of material consumption. So essentially it's very simple. Thus far the Eco Design Directive has worked, shown results, but doesn't take into account all loops of circular economy, whereas the researchers want to have let's say a holistic approach to the new directives that are coming in for the eco design. So with this, the Eco Design Directive part of the lecture gets completed. Okay, we are at the final part of the lecture. The important thing that I want to convey in this particular part of the lecture is that we have different circular economy policies at different stages, right? And they are not always acting in tandem, in harmony. You have at times conflict, and you need to resolve these conflict to have some sort of integration and harmonization. So what are the examples that we can provide? So let's take the green public procurement we were talking about. Some municipalities have wanted to procure reconditioned furniture, which is good because it falls under one of the loops of circular economy. But sometimes the chemical content in the reconditioned furniture is questionable. They may not meet the chemical regulations, such as having an FSC certified wood. How do we solve such a conflict? One way is to approach to have separate procurement programs for the reconditioned, refurbished products versus, let's say, for new products. So we can have more stringent regulations on new products, and we can have a little bit of a lax regulation on the reconditioned and refurbished product. And one important area of conflict always is going to be durability. This is a question for the ages. We have, of course, now a lot of LED lamps, incandescent lamps are on its way out and so on, okay. But you can take an example of any other products, not even the lamps. The key question is very simple. We now have at this particular point a need to design long-lasting products, right? But what if we create really long-lasting products which has significantly high use phase energy? What if in the next few years we are able to innovate so much that we bring down the use phase of such a product a lot, and then durability actually becomes a burden and not really a help? You see? So is durability good? That's a question that is too hard to answer, and we cannot answer it in general. Durability is good for mature technology. So if you have a technology which has really attained its maturity, and there is not a lot of innovation coming up in future which can drastically alter its use phase energy, then it makes sense to actually have implementation of durability measures. Okay, then is another conflict that I have already hinted: having recycled content in products. On one hand, you really need this, because if you don't have laws for recycled content in products, people will just recycle things because you ask them to, and then these things can be downcycled in the future without actually having a realistic circular economy. So how do you solve this thing? It's really difficult. On one hand, you can have a really good recycling of plastics, and the plastics might still have the persistent organic pollutant, the POPs we were talking about. Once you have that in the recycled plastics, they are of course conflicting with the chemical regulations. You cannot use them back again in fresh products, then it becomes an issue. So what you can do is to have, let's say, a really nuanced approach to this. You can say that, okay, I don't want the plastics with POP into use in stuffs which are constantly in interaction with people. For instance, let's say I don't want it near children where people are more vulnerable to it. We can put these kind of plastics in heavy machineries which are not often in contact with people, where a lot of automation is going on. So these are the measures we can actually come up with. So I already gave you 3 different examples of conflicting policies. So essentially we have covered quite a bit when it comes to policies and legislations of circular economy. We have talked in detail about the waste related policies, as well as different levels and different loops of circular economy policies that could be implemented. So with this, we end the lecture on the policy module. All you have is only one module left, which talks about the criticisms on circular economy.